In part 1 of The Bank War, we stepped back and looked at the characters who built the United States into a sovereign, self-sufficient nation, and how different leaders at different moments shaped the country to reflect their ideals. Their ethics, their economic philosophies, and their ideologies were not abstract. They were embedded directly into the Constitution, in how it was written, how it was interpreted, and, depending on your view, how it was bent or manipulated. Decentralized versus centralized banking. Hard, safe money versus flexible, opportunistic paper credit. These were not just technical disputes. They were direct reflections of the Founding Fathers' competing visions. All of them spoke the language of freedom, but they held very different beliefs about how freedom was achieved. From its earliest days, the United States struggled to define its identity. Caught between the ideals of a free republic and the hard constraints of making that vision work in the real world. Just 20 years after the creation of the first highly contested, and to many, unconstitutional, national bank, it was dismantled and dismissed as unnecessary, even dangerous, for a nation that sought independence from parasitic financial power. Yet, only a few years later, after alienating shareholders, antagonizing the most powerful empire on earth, Britain, engaging in reckless trade policy, and reducing its naval capacity, the United States found itself brutally unprepared for the realities of standing alone. The War of 1812 exposed those weaknesses. When it ended, the national bank returned. What followed was a period of explosive growth. The United States did what it did best. It promoted investment, expanded credit, and built a vast industrial economy in the North, alongside an agricultural kingdom in the South, a system that appeared, on the surface, to be self-sustaining. But there was a problem. Life was too good. Opportunity was abundant. Credit was easy. Optimism was everywhere. The so-called era of good feelings had an expiration date, as it always does, in both ancient and modern societies. And that expiration arrives when the financial bubble that created those good feelings finally collapses, leaving someone holding the proverbial bag. At the center of that collapse stood the Second Bank of the United States, a powerful, controversial institution, once again accused of being unconstitutional, and now deeply entangled in the nation's economic pain. And as history repeatedly shows, it is in moments of mass hardship, anger, and elite failure that populist figures rise. Andrew Jackson had already tasted political defeat in 1824, a loss he blamed on what he called the Hydra of corruption. But in 1828, carried by a wave of popular resentment and democratic energy, he returned, victorious. His comeback echoed a pattern that feels strikingly familiar in modern politics. This time, Jackson did not just win the presidency. He arrived with a mandate. Although Jackson did not enter the White House declaring immediate war on the banks, his arrival in the presidential chair was met with something far more dangerous to entrenched power: mass jubilation. To his supporters, Jackson had come to purge corruption from the seat of government and return political authority to the people themselves. And they loved him for it. His inauguration made that reality impossible to ignore. An estimated 10 to 20,000 ordinary Americans, farmers, laborers, frontiersmen, flooded Washington and poured into the White House to celebrate his victory. And from this very first moment, the fault lines of the coming conflict were already visible. Newspapers aligned with the National Republican Party, soon to rebrand themselves as the Whigs, seized the scene as an opportunity not to reflect on the problems that led to them losing their power in office, but instead to attack. What was meant to be a ceremonial reception for elite, well-to-do Americans was instead described by Jackson's enemies as a rowdy party. Evidence, they claimed, that Jackson represented disorder, not democracy. Jackson and his staff, for their part, made little effort to restrain the chaos, and probably even encouraged it. Contemporary accounts suggest wine was poured onto the lawn to draw the crowds outside. To Henry Clay and the National Republicans, this only confirmed their worst fears. They described the scene in horrified terms: a rabble mob of boys, Negroes, women, children, scrambling, fighting, romping. This language mattered. It was not merely discussed, it was strategy. By portraying ordinary citizens as an unruly mass incapable of self-restraint, Jackson's opponents sought to prove that Washington had fallen under mob rule, that Jackson and the people who supported him were unfit for self-government. But, as the story unfolds, something interesting becomes clear. These newspaper attacks, rhetorical bullets intended to wound political opponents, did not weaken Jackson or his supporters. They strengthened them. Each insult hardened loyalty. Each dismissal deepened identification. The more the press talked down to them, the more unified and resolute the populist base became. And yet, as is so often the case in elite battles against populist movements, this dynamic went entirely unrecognized. The assumption persisted that ridicule demoralizes, that moral scolding disciplines, that contempt persuades. From the very first day of Jackson's presidency, the battle lines were drawn, and the tactics were already on display. On one side stood signals of superiority, order, and institutional authority, the banking interests. On the other stood the raw, unfiltered force of mass democratic support, shaped by the lived experience of exclusion, humiliation, and repeated economic betrayal. For the first time in the nation's short history, the competing ethics, philosophies, and ideologies that had long clashed and fused in the building of the United States were now fully crystallized into opposing political parties. In Part 1, we saw how a vision for a self-sustaining American empire took shape, one that relied on protective tariffs, concentrated banking power, and the deliberate elevation of domestic industry. This framework openly channeled advantage toward banks and industrialists in the belief that their strength would secure the nation as a whole. That vision became known as the American system. Andrew Jackson moved to reverse those tariffs, allowing Southern plantation owners to better afford the tools and everyday manufactured goods necessary to run their operations profitably. But he did so gradually, giving Northern industrialists time to improve efficiency and lower costs in order to compete with Britain, which at the time was deep into its own industrial revolution and capable of producing many goods at prices American producers could not yet match. Jackson did not enter office as a man already at war with the bank. He moved carefully within the political field, even working closely with men who would soon become his most determined opponents. None more important than Nicholas Biddle, the president of the Second Bank of the United States. Biddle was everything Jackson was not. Young, polished, and aristocratic in bearing, he dressed immaculately, spoke with precision, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed the machinery of finance was best entrusted to those trained to operate it. He looked like authority, and in Washington, appearance mattered. Despite this contrast, Jackson initially worked with Biddle. Together, they discussed plans to pay down the national debt, a goal both men supported. At the same time, Jackson quietly consulted with advisors and political allies who would later stand against him, laying the groundwork to loosen, and eventually dismantle, the link between the federal government and the national bank. Then, in 1829, the first warning shot was fired. It was not an open attack. Jackson did not declare war on the bank. Instead, in his annual message to Congress, he raised measured doubts about the bank's role in controlling the nation's currency and questioned its constitutional legitimacy. He even praised certain aspects of its operation. But woven through that restraint was a clear signal: reform was coming. This ambiguity was intentional. It kept Jackson's opponents off balance while allowing him to consolidate support in Congress and continue feeding the moral energy of his populist base. On the surface, he appeared cooperative. Beneath it, the direction of travel was unmistakable. Biddle understood this, and while the public exchange remained polite, both men recognized what was unfolding. When Jackson's re-election approached, restraint gave way to calculation. And that is when the real first shots of the bank war were fired. Biddle's plan was simple, and in his own mind, unbeatable. The bank's charter, the legal authority that allowed it to exist and operate as the nation's central financial institution, was not due to expire until 1836. Throughout its history, that charter had been constitutionally contested and politically controversial. The bank's place in American life was precarious. By forcing an early recharter in the heat of Jackson's 1832 re-election campaign, Biddle aimed to lock in the bank's future and corner the president into a public choice. If Jackson supported the bank, he would betray his instincts and alienate the mass of ordinary voters who had carried him to power. If he opposed it, he would provoke Congress and risk losing the institutional support he needed to govern. Either way, Biddle believed Jackson would pay a political price. It was a classic financial hedge. Heads, the bank wins. Tails, Jackson loses. And from Biddle's perspective, whichever way the coin landed, the bank would emerge intact. However, Biddle made a mistake no political opponent can afford to make when facing a battle-hardened man like Andrew Jackson. He underestimated him. He tried to pin him into a corner, but misread the room entirely. Expecting a soldier to capitulate under pressure is not strategy, it is naivete. Biddle assumed Jackson would do what many presidents before him had done, sign reluctantly or refuse to champion the bank while quietly deferring the decision to Congress, absolving himself of responsibility and avoiding direct confrontation. Instead, Jackson absorbed the first blow and escalated the conflict. He rejected the bill outright, attaching a formal veto message that framed the bank as an enemy of the people. Though that message was formally directed to Congress, Jackson knew exactly where his real audience lay, who would hear him, and who would reject him regardless. He did not waste time courting his enemies. The message was written for his political base. In it, Jackson argued that the bank was unconstitutional because the Constitution did not explicitly grant Congress the power to create such a corporation. He claimed it violated states' rights by operating without their consent and condemned it as a monopoly that enriched wealthy elites, including foreign stockholders, at the expense of ordinary Americans. He described the recharter as a gratuity of many millions to the rich, warned that it concentrated dangerous levels of power over currency and credit in a single institution, and portrayed the bank as a corrupting force in politics itself. Most importantly, Jackson framed the veto as an act of defense of the people themselves, farmers, mechanics, and laborers, against aristocratic privilege. In doing so, he elevated the presidency into a direct check on legislative overreach and transformed a banking dispute into a moral confrontation, with the nation watching. What followed was open warfare, fought in newspapers, pamphlets, cartoons, and Senate speeches in full view of the nation. Opposition presses, backed by national Republican figures, unleashed a coordinated campaign to discredit Jackson. He was portrayed as reckless, ignorant, and dangerous, a demagogue threatening the stability of the Republic itself. Nicholas Biddle and pro-bank editors ensured Jackson's veto message was circulated widely, but not to persuade, to condemn. It was denounced as a manifesto of anarchy, accused of inciting class warfare by deliberately pitting the poor against the rich. On the Senate floor, Webster warned that Jackson was inflaming prejudices and resentments among the masses, undermining respect for property, institutions, and law. To the bank's defenders, this was not merely a veto. It was an assault on social order. The imagery soon turned darker. Clay-aligned newspapers and Whig presses depicted Jackson as King Andrew I, abusing the veto power beyond constitutional limits, defying the Supreme Court's ruling in McCulloch v. Maryland, and ruling by personal will rather than law. Political cartoons showed him crowned and trampling the Constitution beneath his feet. The language of monarchy, despotism, tyranny, mob rule returned in force. Old accusations were revived and sharpened. The inauguration crowd was once again invoked as evidence that Jackson governed for the rabble. Editorials warned that the veto rewarded uneducated farmers and laborers by redistributing power away from responsible elites. Broadsides accused Jackson of hypocrisy for previously using bank funds, of corruption, and of running the presidency like a military command. Biddle quietly financed much of this effort, convinced that public fear of disorder would overwhelm Jackson's appeal. But something went badly wrong. The harder Jackson was attacked, the stronger his support became. What his opponents saw as demagoguery, his base heard as defiance. What elites framed as anarchy, ordinary voters recognized as representation. The smear campaign did not fracture Jackson's coalition, it consolidated it. Congress failed to override the veto. And when the election came, the result was unmistakable. The 1832 campaign became a direct referendum on the second bank of the United States. Jackson's Democrats framed the contest as the people versus the aristocracy. Jackson organized Hickory Clubs, local Democratic organizations designed to bolster his support. Jacksonian newspapers flooded the country, and the bank was placed squarely at the center of national debate. Clay warned of economic chaos and instability if the bank were destroyed. Jackson countered by tying the institution to the corrupt bargain of 1824, accusing it of financing his enemies then, and funding the attack against him now. Jackson won decisively. He interpreted the victory as a popular mandate, not merely to oppose the bank, but to dismantle it. For his supporters, the message was clear. The people did not want the bank. For the financial and political elites aligned against him, the message was unmistakable. If Jackson could not be defeated at the ballot box, he would be resisted by other means, through institutions, credit, reputation, and public legitimacy. The moves Jackson was making were unpredictable and, in terms of political warfare, highly effective. Rather than confronting his enemies head-on, he moved first to strip them of their weapons. In this case, that weapon was money, much of it supplied by the federal government. Roughly $10 million in federal deposits sat inside the bank, the equivalent of around $300 million today, accounting for nearly 30% of its total deposits. The objective was straightforward: withdraw a substantial portion of the bank's capital, cripple its ability to operate, and in the process sever its capacity to fund political opposition. Jackson, though commander-in-chief, did not move recklessly. The law was clear. Only the Secretary of the Treasury had the authority to remove federal deposits from the bank, and only for reasons which he shall report to Congress. And so he advanced at a measured pace, not slowly, but with control, consulting first with his Treasury Secretary, William Duane, to devise a lawful plan to remove the deposits. Duane hesitated. He argued that he could only carry out such an order for clear financial reasons and with a full explanation to Congress. There was no immediate financial emergency, he insisted, and he refused to violate the law or establish a dangerous precedent. He told Jackson he would consider the matter and review the evidence. Jackson was patient, but not passive. He did not wait quietly for Duane to disappoint him. Pressure increased. Duane made it clear that if he could not, in good conscience, carry out the order, he would resign, a statement that opened the path Jackson had anticipated. Then Duane switched sides. The Treasury Secretary consulted beyond Jackson's circle, and Jackson's political opponents moved quickly. Allies of Henry Clay and other anti-administration figures warned Duane that the Treasury must not become an instrument of presidential will. The office, they argued, belonged to the Secretary, not to the President. Duane absorbed the message and changed course. He refused to carry out the order, declined to resign voluntarily, and instead insisted that the matter be referred to Congress. At that moment, the line was crossed. Jackson moved without delay. He removed William Duane from office and, the same day, appointed Roger B. Taney as Secretary of the Treasury, under a recess appointment. Taney understood the assignment immediately. He began executing Jackson's policy at once, halting the placement of new federal deposits into the second bank and ordering existing funds to be transferred to selected state banks. In doing so, millions of dollars in customs duties, land sale receipts, and other federal revenues were redirected into state institutions that had never before handled sums of that scale. The bank had lost another battle, but this time it wasn't merely political, it was financial. Biddle was enraged. The state banks celebrated. In principle, these institutions were intended to decentralize federal finance and democratize credit, a system more closely aligned with the spirit of the Constitution as Jackson, Jefferson, Madison, and other founding fathers understood it. Power over money, in this view, was not meant to be concentrated, but dispersed. Jackson's opponents, however, saw something very different. They mockingly labeled the institutions pet banks, framing them as tools of political favor rather than reform. The selection of these banks was shaped by political alignment, creating what contemporaries described as a privilege system. State banks sympathetic to the administration received federal deposits, gaining both prestige and expanded lending capacity, while institutions viewed as hostile were excluded. For Jackson and Taney, this redistribution of fiscal authority fulfilled a long-standing objective: breaking the dominance of a single financial institution and returning control over money to the states. To critics, however, it blurred the line between public finance and party politics, weaving the Democratic coalition into the nation's financial infrastructure. In practical terms, the new arrangement expanded access to credit, particularly across the growing western frontier. As the country pushed outward, state banks used federal deposits to extend loans that supported settlement, commerce, and development, circulating capital through local economies, rather than concentrating it in a single national institution. Biddle was enraged that this new president had the audacity to remove federal deposits. Funds Biddle believed his bank was entitled to was intolerable. He took stock of the weapons still at his disposal: political allies in Congress, sympathetic newspapers, and above all, the immense financial power of a monolithic institution that sat at the center of American credit. He moved to counterattack. Biddle's first move was financial. He contracted credit. Loans were slashed. Existing debts were called in. New extensions of credit were refused, particularly to state banks and merchants dependent on bank funds. Note, circulation was tightened. The result was a nationwide credit squeeze. And crucially, Biddle framed the pain as proof that Jackson's so-called pet bank system was crippling the economy, when in reality it was the bank's deliberate actions that were inflicting the damage. Biddle believed the strategy would work. By engineering widespread distress, he expected public opinion and Congress to turn against Jackson, forcing a reversal of the deposit removal. In a private letter to Henry Clay in December 1833, Biddle made his thinking explicit, saying, "This will cause such distress universally that the people will call for the recharter of the bank." Jackson's opponents in Congress, particularly Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, seized on the resulting disruption. They argued that Jackson's removal of deposits was reckless, unlawful, and directly responsible for the economic pain spreading across the country. Jackson's allies countered sharply. They accused Biddle of deliberate financial strangulation, portraying him as an unelected autocrat weaponizing credit to punish the public for political defiance. The charge was simple and devastating. The bank was making the people suffer to restore its own power. Public sentiment began to shift. Working men and small farmers, already distrustful of financial elites, saw confirmation of Jackson's warnings. Even moderates, once sympathetic to the bank, began to question whether so much economic power should rest in the hands of a single, unelected financier. One story, repeated in partisan newspapers and later political recollections, captured the mood. A member of Congress, formerly friendly to the bank, claimed to have overheard Biddle boast at a social gathering that he could bring the country to its knees by tightening credit, and that once distress spread, order would be restored. Whether literal or apocryphal, the story resonated. It crystallized a growing perception that Biddle viewed the nation's economy as a lever of political control. For many observers, this was the danger Jackson had warned against from the beginning, that a single financial institution, led by an unelected man, could hold the republic hostage to its will. Once again, attacks meant to break Jackson backfired. Sympathy for the bank eroded. Opposition fractured. And under mounting public pressure, Biddle was eventually forced to ease the credit contraction, retreating from financial warfare and turning back toward the political arena in search of another way to strike at Jackson. With financial retaliation failing to break Jackson's support, the battle shifted arenas. If the bank could not force surrender through credit, then Jackson would be challenged through institutions. Henry Clay seized the opening. Clay, long the intellectual architect of the American system, and now Jackson's chief political rival, reframed the conflict not as a struggle over banking, but as a crisis of constitutional order. The issue, he argued, was no longer the bank. It was the presidency itself. Jackson's removal of the deposits, Clay claimed, represented an abuse of executive power, a dangerous precedent that placed the will of one man above Congress, the law, and the Constitution. Clay was joined by Daniel Webster and other national Republicans, soon to consolidate as the Whig Party. Together, they launched a formal Senate offensive. Their aim was clear: to brand Jackson not merely as wrong, but as illegitimate. In March 1834, the attack was formalized. The Senate passed a resolution of censure, a symbolic but serious rebuke, declaring that Andrew Jackson had assumed upon himself authority and power not conferred by the Constitution and laws. It was the first time in American history that a president had been formally censured by Congress. Importantly, the censure did not reverse Jackson's actions. It did not restore the deposits. It did not revive the bank. What it sought to do instead was shape perception, to fix in the public mind the image Jackson's enemies had been cultivating all along: a lawless executive, trampling institutions, ruling by personal will. But here, too, the strategy misfired. The censure passed the Senate, but it never reached the House, where Jackson's supporters held firm. To the president's base, the vote looked less like a defense of the Constitution and more like elite retaliation, a political punishment imposed by men who had lost both the election and the argument. Jackson responded with characteristic defiance. He refused to acknowledge the censure as legitimate. Instead, he ordered his allies to enter a formal protest into the Senate Journal, rejecting the charge outright, and once again appealing over the heads of institutions to the people themselves. And the people heard him, they listened, and they stood with Jackson. The message was unmistakable. What had begun as a dispute over banking had become something far larger, a struggle over sovereignty itself, whether power belonged to institutions, foreign-owned banks, unelected financiers, compromised elites, or to the people who elected their president. The bank had lost its money. Its allies had failed to break Jackson politically. And now, even the Senate's authority was being openly challenged. Yet even as Jackson prevailed, politically, financially, and institutionally, the war was not over. Because beneath the visible battles in Congress and the newspapers, another struggle was unfolding, quieter, more technical, and far harder to fight. Not a conflict between men, but between rules, between incentives, between metals. The American monetary system Jackson inherited was still bound by an outdated constraint, a fixed legal ratio between gold and silver. Under U.S. law, gold and silver were treated as equals in circulation, locked together at a 15-to-1 ratio. That ratio had been set in the early Republic, carried over from late 18th century British assumptions, and formalized in American law in the 1790s. But the world had moved on. On international markets, gold was becoming more valuable relative to silver, In Britain, the price of gold was not fixed by law, but adjusted continuously, with each private banking house setting their prices dynamically, not by law but by supply and demand, trade flows, credit needs, and the realities of empire. Prices moved, ratios flexed, incentives adjusted. When two forms of money circulate side by side, but one carries a legal face value that no longer matches its true worth, a predictable pattern emerges. In this case, gold was worth more abroad than the value stamped onto federally issued American coins. And when that happens, people do what incentives demand. They hoard the more valuable money and spend the less valuable one, a principle later formalized as Gresham's Law. This dynamic had been observed for centuries, but for Americans living through it in the early republic, it was simply a lived experience. Silver stayed, gold left, not because of panic, not because of conspiracy, but because the rules made it profitable for it to do so. Much of that gold was melted down by bankers and speculators who understood the system, sold abroad at higher market prices, and pocketed the difference. The law did not prevent this behavior. It encouraged it. And so, even as Jackson was defeating the bank in public view, hard money was quietly draining out of the country, beyond speeches, beyond vetoes, beyond the reach of political theater. Economic reality always holds the final trump card, and until the underlying monetary rules are aligned with financial reality, no political victory, however decisive, can truly win a bank war. After all, Jackson's vision of a republic grounded in hard money, circulating among the people, could not be realized if hard money itself was disappearing from circulation. A nation cannot run on gold and silver that no longer exists within its borders. Without correction, scarcity would push the country back toward what Jackson despised most: reliance on paper currency, the very instrument Benjamin Franklin had once used pragmatically to address gold and silver shortages in the colonies before the Revolution. That system worked then to keep the economy functioning, but it also opened the door to foreign influence and financial dependence, conditions Jackson, Jefferson, and many of the founding fathers had labored to escape. In other words, defeating the bank was not enough. Jackson had to align his philosophies with the unchanging laws of economics. And so the turn toward monetary reform was not sudden. It was the continuation of the same economic philosophy that had driven his campaign against the national bank from the beginning. At its core was a hard money conviction that gold and silver, specie, were the only legitimate and honest forms of money. Paper currency, credit, and debt were not, in his view, neutral tools, but instruments of manipulation, and the hardship that followed them was the predictable result. To implement his reforms, Jackson turned to the Treasury Secretary, Roger Taney, who had executed the removal of federal deposits with uncompromising force, became politically untenable, and when the Senate reconvened, it refused to confirm his appointment. Jackson did not abandon the project. Instead, he appointed Levi Woodbury, a steadier, less confrontational figure, but one fully aligned with his hard money philosophy, to carry the next phase forward. The task now shifted from breaking concentrated power to redesigning the system beneath it. Where Taney had stripped the bank of its financial leverage, Woodbury turned to the deeper problem at its core, restoring a metallic standard rooted in what Jackson saw as real value, moral order, and democratic legitimacy. That effort took shape by altering the rules of money itself, through the Coinage Act of 1834. The solution to the gold drain, in their eyes, was straightforward: raise the legal gold-to-silver ratio to 16:1, bringing it into line with international markets. By doing so, gold would be deliberately overvalued at the U.S. Mint, reversing the arbitrage incentive that had been draining it from the country. The Coinage Act reduced the gold content of the U.S. Eagle, the $10 gold coin, from 247.5 grains to 232 grains, an effective debasement of roughly 6%. This adjustment brought the coin's metal value back into alignment with its face value in domestic circulation, eliminating the profit from melting or exporting it. Even when hoarded, the gold no longer disappeared. It remained within the system, resurfacing, circulating, and restoring hard money to everyday use. Nicholas Biddle, predictably, saw the move as economically misguided and politically driven, a threat to the credit-based financial system he believed was essential to national stability. In his view, the bank's note circulation provided the nation with a stable yet elastic currency, flexible enough to expand when commerce and growth demanded it, and contract when inflationary pressures began to build. Gold and silver, he argued, were important anchors, sources of underlying value, but on their own they were insufficient to meet the monetary needs of a large, rapidly growing economy. In a sense, both sides were correct. The deeper problem was not simply disagreement over what the monetary system should be, but in the execution of the system itself. Once written into law, it is not words that determine the outcomes, but people. And people are subject to human nature, incentives, and pressures that can distort even the most well-intentioned designs. In the end product policymakers sought to create was rarely the outcome that actually emerged. The Coinage Act, though principled in intent, was not immune to this reality. It successfully corrected the gold imbalance and restored gold to daily circulation, but silver was left unchanged. As global conditions shifted, silver became more valuable, particularly abroad. Under the new ratio, the silver dollar contained metal worth slightly more than its face value. The result was immediate and predictable. Silver was undervalued at home and flowed outward to where it was more highly valued. Merchants and bullion traders, particularly those operating in tea and silk markets, quickly recognized the opportunity. Asian markets, especially China, maintained a strong preference for silver over gold, and silver commanded higher purchasing power there. With American demand for Chinese goods high, silver coins flowed outward, exported, traded, and absorbed where they were most valued. The Coinage Act's rigid ratio made this arbitrage profitable, and once again, it was not domestic intention, but global demand that determined where America's money ultimately went. What is the lesson here? The Coinage Act of 1834, though implemented to restore natural order and dismantle corruption, exposed a deeper flaw in the Jacksonian approach to money. It treated value as something that could be legislated rather than discovered through market interaction. Value is not static. It flows like water, responding to pressure, scarcity, and incentive. To dismantle the bank without fully adhering to natural economic law beneath it was to risk recreating the very forces Jackson sought to destroy, simply in another form. The failure of the Coinage Act was not one of arithmetic. The 16-to-1 ratio was defensible at the time, but it was rigid in a system governed by flexibility. By fixing value in law, it imposed a static framework onto a system governed by fluid market forces, making it incompatible with how value is actually discovered. The law cannot define what is and what is not valuable, and to what degree a thing can be valued. Had the Jacksonian administration more fully recognized the limits of legal power, it might have been better positioned to achieve the outcomes it sought. The British understood this. Rather than fixing statutory ratios, their system allowed individual financial institutions to set prices dynamically, responding to ever-changing market conditions at home and abroad. Money and value cannot be reliably or sustainably legislated. The more effective approach is always to legislate the environment around money while allowing money itself to find its price naturally through market interaction and price discovery. Jackson, and the presidents who followed him, would have further opportunities to address these contradictions. But history does not resolve problems cleanly. It forces leaders to respond to consequences first. This episode closes shortly after Jackson miraculously survives an assassination attempt, occurring not long after the implementation of the Coinage Act of 1834. Far from slowing him down, it hardened his resolve. Jackson continued pushing reforms aimed, in his view, at freeing the American people from what he saw as parasitic financial power. The system he and his supporters reshaped ushered in an era of so-called free banking that lasted until the Civil War. But the war did not end. It changed theaters. What followed was no longer merely an internal struggle over institutions within the United States, but an expanding conflict between the American system and foreign financial interests that repeatedly collided with the vision of economic independence held by many of the Founding Fathers. If you want to explore what happened next, the real causes of the Panic of 1837, the role of the specie circular, foreign financial pressure, and how Jackson's successors carried the fight forward, let me know. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and we'll continue the war.